In this final lesson, examining topic 2 of our studies in the French Revolution for AQA A-level history, we're going to talk about the formal collapse of the constitutional experiment. This takes us into the devolution, essentially devolving into a system of the Reign of Terror. That will be the subject of the next few lessons in topic 3 when we look about the establishment of the Republic and the Reign of Terror. But specifically in this lesson, we're going to be talking about the role of the sans-culottes, the collapse of the constitutional experiment, the experiment in constitutional monarchy. This includes an examination of the September massacres and the elections of the National Convention. And then we will sort of wrap up at the end of this lesson by just talking about where we basically are as the sort of conclusion of this chapter unfolds. So let's begin then. We're going to begin by thinking about the sans-culottes. And the first question that we can ask is who in fact were the sans-culottes? Well, the sans-culottes were primarily a group of urban workers, artisans, small shopkeepers who generally resided in Paris. Their name was essentially the meaning, the translation without breeches, symbolized their rejection of the aristocratic fashion of wearing knee breeches, which were called culottes. They were essentially quite symbolic in terms of their identification with the ordinary and the common people. Now, they were deeply influenced by revolutionary ideals. So the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, for example. But they were also driven by economic concerns. We also have to remember that sort of permeating the entirety of the French Revolution is the financial crisis that causes the establishment of the Estates General by Louis XVI all the way back in 1791. And so these economic concerns included high food prices, included unemployment, and so generally speaking were also a very influential part of the sans-culottes movement. When it came to sort of their politics, they supported quite extensively the idea of direct democracy, radical social reforms, and also the abolition of the monarchy. And so that is the thing that is very important for the role of the sans-culottes in relation to Louis XVI. They supported the abolition of the position of monarchy. They became the backbone of the radical revolutionary factions, such as that of the Jacobins. And so when we think about the role of the sans-culottes by 1792, we can see that they would play a significant role in the collapse and the disestablishment of monarchy. The widespread dissatisfaction with the constitutional monarchy had peaked in 1792. This is, of course, as the result of a number of different events which takes place. You, of course, have Louis XVI's flight to Valence in 1791, which was a failure and then was recaptured, and then he was escorted back to Paris, and it showed symbolically how much he hated the idea of constitutional monarchy. You also have the War of the First Coalition, the wars against Austria and Prussia, beginning in April 1792, exacerbating the fear that there may be a counter-revolution and betrayal by the king of the French people. And then, of course, you have the sort of permeating factors, including the economic hardships, the food shortages, the inflation, all of which radicalizing the urban poor within French society, especially around the sort of the urban centers, places like Paris, for example. More specifically then, on the 10th of August of 1792, we see the storming of the Tuileries Palace, which was encouraged by a number of different political clubs, including the Jacobins and the Cordeliers, but included also the sans-culottes. They led massive insurrections against the royal palace. Thousands of the National Guardsmen who were attempting to try and defend the palace were overwhelmed, and they were essentially overwhelming the King's Swiss Guard, resulting in fact, the death of quite a few hundred of these soldiers. Louis XVI and his family instead sought to try and refuge themselves in the Legislative Assembly, but at this point, the monarchy would effectively and very quickly become overthrown. the Legislative Assembly would then suspend the monarchy, and they placed Louis XVI and his family under arrest. A national convention would then be called to try and draft a new republican constitution, and this marked the end of the constitutional experiment that involved the idea of monarchy, that involved Louis XVI. The collapse of the constitutional monarchy marked the end of the 1791 constitution, but it also marked a much more dire and much more violent process within French society, because it represented the start of a radical phase of the revolution, something we'll get to later on. The immediate radical phase then was in relation to the September massacres. Now, as a general background, the revolution was facing a relatively existential crisis by the later period of the summer of 1792. You have to remember that there were a number of military defeats that took place within the Austro-Prussian French War. The French army, for example, suffered military defeats against Austria and Prussia. In July of 1792, you also have what is known as the Brunswick Manifesto. This threatened Paris with destruction if the royal family was harmed, again intensifying fears of the invasion. This sort of reinforced the previously established declaration that was made by Austria that essentially came to the conclusion that if you harm the royal family, if you harm the royalty of the French monarchy, then this will lead to destruction of the French state. There were rumours, in fact, of counter-revolutionary threats. Rumours of conspiracies by the imprisoned royalists and the counter-revolutionaries also would begin to spread fear among the pro-revolutionary forces. You also see the anger of the sans-culottes movement. They became increasingly distrustful, not only of the royalists, of course, as you can probably imagine, but they also became quite distrustful of the moderates, and they demanded harsh measures against the perceived internal enemies. All of this was sort of a build-up to what became known as the September massacres, that took place from the 2nd to the 6th of September of 1792. Armed mobs of sans-culottes, incited by radical leaders such as Jean-Paul Marat, would storm the prisons in Paris. They would take thousands of prisoners, including members of the nobility, members of the clergy, general royalists, and common criminals, and they would execute them in a series of brutal killings. General estimates of how many people died in the September massacres ranges from around 1,100 to 1,400 people. So just think that's a lot of people to be murdered in the span of 4 or so days. The September massacres had a significant impact then. They marked a significant turning point when it comes to the greater violence and radicalization of the revolution. These past sort of 4 or 5 lessons, we've sort of been thinking about the revolution with, in the back of our minds, what we know comes after the revolution, what we know that comes after the collapse of the constitutional monarchy, the collapse of Louis XVI's position from power, which is of course the Republic, but also the Reign of Terror. So that's sort of kept in the back of our minds as we sort of very slowly trundle our way towards what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. There would be a significant amount of political division in response to the massacres as well. You have people like radicals, such as Jean-Paul Marat, who would justify the massacres. He said that the massacres were necessary. It was part of the survival of the revolution. However, on the other hand, moderates and foreign observers were horrified at the idea of the September massacres. It led to an international outrage. It shocked Europe and solidified anti-revolutionary sentiment and intensified the wars against France. This all leads to the national elections, so the elections of the National Convention of 1792. The monarchy had been abolished. The Legislative Assembly then called for elections to the new National Convention in order to try and draft a new Republican constitution. Now, ultimately, the elections were based on the idea of universal male suffrage. So this was a major departure from the property-based voting system that existed in the previous constitution, the Constitution of 1791, and the first time the National Convention would meet would be on the 20th of September 1792. And this in fact coincided with a French victory in the Wars of the First Coalition, the French victory at the Battle of Valmy, which boosted the revolutionary morale. So it was generally seen as a more positive time, especially compared to the start of September with the September massacres. The convention was, however, deeply divided, mainly between two main factions. You have the radicals on the one hand, the Jacobins, who were the radical revolutionaries. They represented the sans-culottes and the urban workers. They were led by figures who were quite significant towards the revolution, but also significant when we think about the Reign of Terror. People like Maximilien Robespierre, people like Georges Danton, people like Jean-Paul Marat, who called not only for the establishment of a republic, which is what the point of the National Convention was, but they called for the execution of the king and for extensive social reforms. On the other hand, you have the moderates, the Girondins. These were people who represented the provinces and the bourgeoisie. They were still supportive of the revolution. They were still supportive of the establishment of a republic at this point. The idea of keeping the constitutional monarchy was basically over at this stage, but they sought to avoid the king's execution. And so for that reason, they generally opposed the radicalism that was associated with the Jacobins. We then also have this idea of the centrist group, which was the Le Plain. Now, the Le Plain was a centrist group, as I've just mentioned, that initially aligned with the Jourdans, but would later start to support the Jacobins as the revolution became more and more radicalized. And all of this leads to the next day in which the Republic is proclaimed. The 21st of September 1792, the National Convention officially abolishes the monarchy. This is the official point at which the monarchy ends and declares that France is now a republic. Now, the decision to execute Louis XVI hasn't yet been made, but it does set the stage for the trial and eventual execution of Louis XVI and the establishment of the Reign of Terror. And that brings us to the final topic, the third topic of this particular A-level syllabus, which is on the emergence and the spread of the Terror. This takes us from September 1792 to 1795, but we can sort of see that the period that leads to the collapse of the constitutional monarchy and the establishment of the National Convention is marked by a growing semblance of radicalism, a growing semblance that the idea of monarchy failed and the idea of a constitutional monarchy also failed. This radicalism was driven largely by the sans-culottes and the Jacobins, and was intensified and heightened the growing willingness of revolutionaries to use violence when we look at illustrations such as that of the September massacres. Now, while the elections of the National Conventions ushered in a new type of republican government, this laid the groundwork for the greater levels of radicalization, the execution and trial of Louis XVI, and culminated in the ultimate reign of terror that eventually precedes the failure of the constitutional experiment.